So even if the money comes through corruption, it is God given. That is what the attitude. Corruption is God made. So if I am functioning in such a fashion, God behind me, He activates me, and whatever words I say, it's all comes from. So everything is God. So that theory is somehow, not in this crude form that I put forward to you, but very subtle fashion they preach to you. And third point is making love with the Dalit woman by her employer is a kind of mercy shown to her by the employer. So this is what Pudumai Pittan. So Pudumai Pittan is one of the very revolutionary writers that Tamil has produced so far. So one of the short stories, he says, because she was sweeping the floor, and this man is very, watching her, and he wants to make sex with her. And then he feels, oh, what she would think. She would think, that oh, how merciful the God is to be with that, the employer of higher caste. This is what a Dalit woman would think. That's what, because, because the, probably true, because what I'm trying to say is everyone is like to associate themselves with the either good or the powerful. Otherwise, why there are some Dalit women who were weeping to the core when Jayalalitha was sent to jail? Because they want to associate with power. Anything powerful and famous, they want to associate themselves. So this, instead of questioning, he's appreciating, he's using it as a joke. It's a joke. We have to laugh. That the landlord is showing some mercy on the servant maid by touching her, by molesting her. So this is the view of the of rape by the mainstream writers. Dalit, because I'm not saying, because there are laws. Our mainstream writers, are they ignorant of such laws? That against the will, if you touch somebody, molest somebody, it's something wrong. But in your writing, you are showing it as a mercy shown to her. How can you defy law in your writing? So, okay, if you defy law and you talk about personal freedom or freedom of the humanity, then it is justified. But you are talking just raw lust, and you are talking about mercy, that is mercy shown to a lower caste female who's working in your household. And the fourth is Dalits suffer from inferiority complex, and as a result hide their caste identity. Even when the dominant caste is willing to forgive him for his caste status, but he is not able to come out of it. This is Rajaji, our former Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu. So he also a storyteller. His Athanari talks about this theme. So a Dalit gets married to an Andhra Brahmin, because a Tamil Brahmin, if he gets married to, he will be murdered. So quietly he makes them married to an Andhra Brahmin, so Andhra people will not question what happens in Tamil Nadu. So he gets married. Finally, his people fall sick, and he has to rush. But he didn't want to go because he will be found out which caste he belongs to. So he allows the parents to die. So the inferiority complex, even because later on they come to know about it, and they say, would have forgiven that, but why did you feel so inferior? So the attitude of writers, because we are inferior and all that, and we will never be able to come out of this mental slavery. And another thing is, if the Dalits are educated and hardworking, they can come up in normal course. So why reservation? So this is mostly, in writings, they because they talk about reservation, and they are going against reservation, and the remedy is only education. And they quote, even Dalit writers sometimes they quote Ambedkar for education, but the truth is other way around, because Ambedkar's main struggle, if you read in history, is for land, is to acquire space for common space for Dalits. Mahat Kula, Mahat Pond struggle, and also Kalaram Kovil, Kalaram temple struggle, And third is the Koti abolition, Koti system abolition struggle in Bombay in 1939. And 1948 in Andhra, he took up a major struggle that was the largest in Asia. And those days, struggle for land. About 1 lakh people he could get in the city of Hyderabad. And also in the Mahajas that he submitted to the British, if you go through, he'll say that a separate settlement is needed for Dalits. And they have to be protected. And a chunk of land has to be given to them. And separate money has to be allotted to improve their status. Of course, education is necessary. But education is not the only remedy, because those who are not willing to part with the resources of this country, which are accumulated in the hands of others, they say that if you are educated, you can come up. Chalo, chalo. Pado, pado. So this is the attitude of the dominant writers. And of course, portrayal of Dalits denying their history, because they will appear as servants, they appear as errand boys. In films, they appear as gundas, and they are merely labor and poor. Recently, I read, it's said to be published, Rupa Viswanathan, she has written a book, The Paraya Problem, how in 4 decades, starting from 1890 to 1930, how the problem of Paraya surfaced in the British regime. And many a time they overlooked as labor problem. And the true problem of Parayas was identified later on. So, because those who don't know the history of Dalits, they see it as labor class, they see it as poor. But if only you know the history, your writing will be certainly different, has to be different. And many of them, mainstream writers, they feel comfortable with their caste status. Never once they question, never once they want to, hide it or feel ashamed of it or guilty about it. And but whereas, the counter writing condemns caste identity, feels guilty about that. And probably, maybe because when I start writing a novel, I wrote about Mudaliar. So I didn't want to end it as with respect. We use a word ir. If you have to give a respect to Mudaliar, Mudaliar Vandar, I have to say. So I wanted to put it Vandan, because caste, whereas Parayan means Vanda, there is no thought about it. So Vanda, all the derogatory language you can fix, situations you can fix for them. So how language helps the dominant to give their due status to each caste. So they are very comfortable with that. They don't question that. So with this, I feel the counter writing, for me, I will be very comfortable to call it as Dalit writing, because Dalit writing has yet another duty apart from countering mainstream writing. That is, to talk about also the purpose of life from the point of view of the Dalits, the attainment of the soul from the point of view of the Dalits, how to redeem poverty from the point of view of Dalits, how to bring revolution in this country. We have our own viewpoints. So I think counter writing is not merely counter the mainstream writers' viewpoints or perspectives, to create a new positive viewpoint for the entire society, not only for Dalits, for the entire society, including Dalits, subaltern, women, etc. So Dalit writing has much to contribute, and I am immensely thankful to the university for bringing me often to talk to scholars and enrich my knowledge as well. Thank you very much.
Sivagami has been an idea, a movement, a representation of the feminine psyche from a subaltern perspective. In fact, when I come to my paper, I have 1 or 2 slides on the grip of change, wherein I would also read her as a kind of feminine eccentric in the prophetic sense, in the liberative sense, just as those mid 1930s London writers who also emerged as romantic eccentrics. Thank you, ma'am, for this ideation, romanticization of that idea that you have given us as a kind of vision, as a perspective, not as a counterpoint. This is the first time some of us we have listened to the kind of stereotypes that are projected by the dominant writers against subalterns. I think she has done it so well that we should be grateful to her for the provocation that she has made for further discussions and deliberations in the course of the seminar. Now we come to Professor M. Dasan. How will I begin? A friend, a colleague, we have met many a time in discourses across India. I would put it this way. Here is a gentleman once listened to, everyone from the mainstream would disown him for the kind of counter perspectives that he gives, for the kind of subaltern views that he has, for the kind of subversive dimensions that he projects in his deliveries, in his communication, in his writing. Professor Dasan has been a student, teacher, and ideologue in the Kerala context, both at Calicut and Kannur universities. He has his degrees in literature, languages, rather German, French, diplomas, and then he has got his MBA in human resource development, and he has held various academic positions, including as a registrar of Kannur University during the Vice Chancellorship tenure of Professor P.K. Rajan and a gem of an academics from Kerala. Professor Dasan is basically a researcher with that kind of predilection for the subalterns, for the Dalit perspectives, for the subaltern perspectives. He has published the Oxford University Anthology on Malayalam Dalit Literature, and he has also his book, another one edited by him, Counterculture Discourses, Dalit Literature in India, probably the first one in the Indian context with that kind of modernity of perspectives, modernist ethos of Dalit perspectives. He has written number of other books, edited number of other books, including the one Narratives of Discontent and Mapping Marginality, Premises and Perspectives in 2011. Some of us have been part of that book too. He has variety of international exposure to number of countries in Europe, in the West, and in Asia. And he has also produced 15 PhD students awarded, 7 MPhil students awarded, and more than that, I would invite him to speak not merely as a kind of discourse thinker, but as a man who is very blunt, absolutely blunt, who has the courage and the wisdom to call spade a spade. Professor M. Dasan to deliver the keynote address.
Yeah, maybe request your permission to go down and sit to listen to you better.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
uh, chairperson of the session, Professor Mukherjee, Dr. Shivakami, A.S. Dasan, organizer Bhimaya. Much thanks for the invitation. I'm a little bit afraid of the timing, so I don't make any introduction. Straight away go. The previous speakers have mentioned some of the things, so probably I might skip. I congratulate Dr. Bhimaya for the venture to opt for a topic which to me is highly significant in the academia. Second, thanks for the invitation. I have slightly changed the title for my presentation, that is counter-cultural writing, to be very specific. Counter-cultural writing, Dalits and other subalterns. The term counterculture was first used by Theodore Roszak in his book, The Making of a Counterculture, Reflections on a Technocratic Society and its Useful Opposition. He was referring to the 1960 student radical Vietnam War protesters and hippie dropouts in the rejection of what he calls the technocracy, while chronicling and explaining European and North American counterculture movements and its responses of the 60s. A counterculture, also written with hyphen and not with hyphen sometimes, is a subculture whose values and norms of behavior differ substantially from those of mainstream or male-stream society, often in opposition to mainstream cultural mores. A countercultural movement expresses the ethos and aspirations of a specific population during a well-defined era. In the context of India, Dalits and other subaltern writing is a part and parcel of a larger socio-political cultural movement and is characterized by the rejection of the cultural hegemony of the dominant Brahminic Hinduism and its justification of caste discrimination and patriarchy. I would just read a paragraph from my latest book, which Professor Dasan referred to, is a collection of articles, Countercultural Discourses in Dalit Literature in India. No period in the history of a country has been characterized by monoculture and univocality. Various epistemologies, philosophies, and worldviews existed simultaneously since known history. The linguistic and cultural domination of an alien race and its gradual control of the social, cultural, and political life of the indigenous peoples of this land is part of our history. The interaction between various races, linguistics, and ethnic groups over the years has produced a hybrid culture and have mutually incorporated many aspects of different cultures, and as a result, the notion of pure culture is no longer valid. Yet, in our social cultural discourse, the values and aesthetics of a dominant culture is often accepted as the norm, and other cultures are considered inferior. Historians have also been accomplices in silencing the heroic struggles and resistance of indigenous people against the external and internal colonizers. Sociologists have consciously or unconsciously involved in constructing the image of the other as uncivilized. Anthropologists were anxious to preserve the primitive people and their cultures and museumize them, for they feared that these people would vanish due to their inherent inability to survive. There existed many Shramana traditions in our country since first millennium, which grew into prominence during the time of Mahavira and Gautama Buddha. These were non-Vedic religious or spiritual movements. We have the Jainis, Buddhists, Charvakas, Ajivaks, and they are but separate from the historical Vedic tradition, which projected counter-cultural discourses, contesting dominant Aryan oblique Hindu oblique Brahminic culture, language, and aesthetics. Colonialism and indigenous cultures, traditions in other parts of the world. Because I am speaking from a department of comparative literature, I have read the latest book by Tuton also, where the whole academic process of comparative literature is moving to cultural studies and then comparative cultural studies. I would also throw possibilities of opening up our debate of the other subaltern writings in relation to some of the other subjectivist writings with which I am familiar, like Canadian First Nation writings or Australian Aboriginal writings, etc., etc., so that the future researchers and scholars probably would, as we all said, could relate themselves to similar counter-cultural discourses, not only in terms of writing, but also in terms of theoretical positions and aesthetics. I would begin, because people have already pointed out this, I'll begin with a quote from Gail Omwood, from Understanding Caste, from Buddha to Ambedkar and beyond. I quote, "The cruelties which the European settlers practiced on American Indians on their first settlement in the New World are certainly their parallel in India, in the advent of subjugation of the Aborigines. This, in short, is the history of Brahmin dominations in India. As the cultures and languages of indigenous people of India, Africa, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, to name only a few, have been destroyed by the invaders, the indigenous writers of these countries tried to reclaim their culture, languages, and epistemologies through oral and written expressions, orality and writing. Though the seminar topic do not mention specifically orality, I do believe that we need to talk about orality as well, because it existed prior to writing. Orality refers to thoughts and verbal expressions in societies where the technologies of literacy, especially writing and print, are unfamiliar to most of the population. It has been a habit of literate cultures to view oral culture simply in terms of their lack of technologies of writing. This habit, Walter J. Ong, a theorist of orality, says is dangerously misled, because he says oral cultures are living cultures in their own right. Anthropologists have often pointed out the dichotomy between oral and literate cultures. We also, as academics, create the binaries. A series of contrastive terms by which each of the two cultures have been associated to binary oppositions. For instance, subjectivity versus objectivity, concreteness versus abstract thought, immediate presence versus historical perspective, blah, 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 blah. More specifically, this list was prolonged wherever oral art forms were compared with written ones, because the former tended to be labeled primitive, old-fashioned, rural, whereas the latter were generally characterized as civilized, modern, and urban. As a result, oral traditions were either excluded from the field of literature, or at best, if they were taken into account, were invariably less valued than written ones. However, current trends in literary studies are revising and questioning these distinct dichotomies, pointing out that they constitute simple categorization of a complex phenomena. A thorough analysis of the main features of contemporary works of oral literature leads to the conclusion that orality is not merely the antithesis of writing, and that both modes of communication are entwined rather than separate. The very notion that cultures evolved from orality to literacy, as if they were successive stages in the single path of cultural evolution, is also disallowed by the plain fact that writing does not extinguish oral cultural transmission. As Ong has pointed out, I quote, writing from the beginning did not reduce orality but enhanced it, unquote. The hybrid nature of a number of Dalit and other subaltern texts resist this categorization, oral written. They often blurs the genres. The orators of indigenous peoples of many former colonies are repositories of songs, tales, myths, which assert identity, culture, languages of these peoples, and do contain various forms of resistance against colonialism, both internal and external, dominant culture and language and ways of life. Adivasi, Dalit orality of our country has always been countercultural since immemorial. It would be interesting for scholars to trace the genealogy of countercultural resistance in our country and probably compare them with similar countercultural movements and literatures in other parts of the countries, and probably compare them with similar movements in other parts of the world. That's what I told, there's a possibility. Two books I can suggest is at least an anthology by J.N. Devi. Two anthologies are available for those who are interested in taking themselves to the tradition of orality in terms of the fourth world writers. One is Indigeneity, Culture and Representation. The other is Voice and Memory. Orion Blackswan, 2009. Because I would like us to broaden the discussion of other subalterns to the fourth world people in other parts of the world, like, as I told you, First Nation, Canadians, or Australian Aboriginals, I would use a term which has already been used in 1974 by Shuswap chief George Manuel. For the first time, he used the word fourth world. The title of the book is The Fourth World and Indian Reality. George Manuel thought of the fourth world as, I'm quoting from him, indigenous peoples descended from a country's aboriginal population and who today are completely or partly deprived of the right of their own territories and its riches. It goes in tally with the resource denial to these aboriginal peoples. Land is a major issue in any of these kinds of fourth world writings. I'm not explaining for want of time. The position of Indian government, I'm sure those who are interested in the rights movement, I'm also a little bit involved, especially even now, because our Adivasis have been struggling in front of the Secretariat for 100 years. So that our Adivasis are not indigenous people, and the international lobbying still continues. Now these people, which I refer to the fourth world people, I would refer them as people who are still being colonized even in post-colonial countries. Incidentally, let me also mention that the title of one of the quarterly by Bengali Sahitya Shastra Academy, quarterly, its name is also Chaturthi Dunia. I recently only came to know about it. Bengali Dalit Sahitya Sanstha quarterly has its name Chaturthi Dunia, which exactly means fourth world. Fourth world writing includes Australian Aboriginal writing, Canadian First Nation writing, African American writing. They all are attempts to retrieve their cultural oral traditions and write back to the empire. They took upon themselves the task of recapturing history and culture through orators and writing. The writings of Dalits and Adivasis share similarities with other fourth world people of various parts of the world. A number of studies, research have been done on these lines. A lot of articles have also been published, even in those countries, Dalit and other subaltern writings. For me, writings includes history, creative writing, polemical, theoretical, which includes writings on aesthetics. Dalit Adivasi writings are stories as well as histories. There's not much a difference between whether it's her story or his story. Stories as histories. I quote from an Australian Aboriginal, well-known academic, professor, writer, novelist, poet, Madruru Narojin. I quote from him. Our story, our history will query what has been written by the dominant society or the dominant power within the society as the true record of a sequence of events. I'm quoting from Us Mob, that is his text. First Nation narrators, First Nation writers, especially people like Thomas King, says our narrative is theory. Don't look for theory to us. Our narratives, our novel, for example, I have in mind many of his novels, especially The Medicine River. We prescribe it for the students. Narrative as theory. Thomas King. Simple reference is Google on the web. You have a small article titled Godzilla versus Postcolonial, wherein which he argues the distrust with postcolonial theoretical framework of the Fourth World people. Dalits and other subaltern writers were always concerned with history and culture. Why? They were trying to reclaim and rewrite their history. Writing, R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G. In fact, one of my scholars did a PhD on this writing history, R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, has been one of the major preoccupations of Dalits and other subaltern writers, as they have been forgotten in dominant histories. Though pain and suffering remain in their collective memories, many of the writers, we need to be self-reflexive as well, many of the Dalit writings have hardly any real conceptions of the origins of their untouchable status. It is where the relevance of Ambedkar's writings, especially who are the Sudras and the untouchable, lies, and it is here this can be treated as caste histories. The untouchable by Ambedkar is a pioneer attempt in the exploration of a field so completely neglected by everybody. Ambedkar's historiography was a creative process of reading history that speaks to the concerns of those whose histories and memories are lost. Colonialist, nationalist historiography. It was mainly the white, upper caste males of the powerful elite who had the means to attend colleges, universities, become professional historians, and shape a view of history that served their own class, race, caste, and gender interest at the expense of those not so fortunate. And quite literally, to taper over aspects of history they found uncomfortable. If there were a universally accepted view of history that never changed, there would be no need to research it further. Many historians who write revisionist exposés are motivated by a genuine desire to correct history. Many great discoveries have come as a result of the research of men and women who have been curious enough to revisit certain historical events and explore them again in depth and a new perspective. Revisionism among the historians now is not considered as a kind of negative thing. Revisionism here would mean a readiness to challenge official explanations. Revisionism is an essential part of the process by which history, through posing of their new problems and the investigation of new possibilities, enlarges its perspective and enriches its insights. Revisionist historians contest the mainstream or traditional view of historical events. They raise views at odds with traditionalists, which must be freshly judged. Fourth World writings are attempts to recuperate lost history, culture, and languages, and identity of their peoples, exhorting them to fight against all forms of oppression and regain their lost status. We can see strong parallels in Dalits and other subaltern writings. The necessity to rewrite history from the perspective of Dalits and other subalterns is because of the trivialization and downright falsification of facts in mainstream historiography. The resistance and protest by Adivasi communities and women against colonial power and feudal oppressors and patriarchy have not found adequate space in the historiography of protest movements. This is a clear reflection of marginalization of Adivasi and women in all spheres. This partial historical amnesia has its roots in the epistemology of historical methodology and its implicit collusion with the socio-political power structures. It follows that each generation has a right to look upon and reinterpret history in its own way. As indigenous historians would say, I'd quote, a small quote, after all, we study history because we are interested in it. And perhaps because we wish to learn something about our problems. But dominant history can serve neither of these two purposes. If, under the influence of an inapplicable idea of objectivity, we hesitate to present historical problems from our own point of view, we should not think that our own point of view, if consciously and critically applied to the problem, will be inferior to that of the writer who naively believes that he, she has created a level of objectivity permitting him, her to present the events of the past as that actually did happen. Revision is the lifeblood of historical scholarship. History is a continuing dialogue between the present and the past. Interpretations of the past are subject to change and respond to new evidences, new questions asked, new perspectives gained. There is no single, eternal, immutable truth about past events and their meanings. The unending quest of historians for understanding the past, that is revisionism, is what makes history vital and meaningful. I cannot help mentioning subaltern historians because history and subaltern is implicit in the topic. In this context of countercultural writing in India, Jyotiba Phule's writings, poems and plays and polemical tracts, has pioneered the project of subaltern group much before they articulated and theorized it. He challenged the existing Brahminical and Orientalist ideologies which used to legitimate the caste system. Phule took his critique of Brahmanism and caste to a mass level by inverting the traditional Aryan theory. He used it to radically interpret Puranic mythology, as reference has already been made by Shivkami, seeing the various avatars of Vishnu at stages in the conquest of India, while taking the Rakshasas as heroes of people. Phule was not simply focusing on ideology and culture, he stressed equally the factors of violence and conquest in history, those which Marx had relegated to the realm of primitive accumulation of capital, and took the peasant community as his center. Phule's contribution in providing a logic of history in India, as Deshpande points out, was equated with Hegel's contribution to Europe. Uma Chakravarti, the feminist scholar, has described Phule as a forerunner elaborating the theory of Brahminical patriarchy. Guha founded the Subaltern Studies Project in collaboration with Syed Amin, David Partha Chatterjee, David, etc., with a specific aim of providing a corrective to the historiography of combating elitism in academic research and writing. He points out that elitist historiography was narrow and partial as a direct consequence of a commitment by scholars to a particular class outlook, which privileged the ideas, activities, and politics of the British colonizers and dominant groups in Indian society. His was an initial turn towards Gramsci, and the assertion of a subaltern perspective into history writing. Guha acknowledges later that factors of domination and coercion were not simply based on or determined by class dynamics in Indian society. However, the writings of Dibesh Chakravarti offered the most extensive contribution within Subaltern Studies project toward, I quote from them, a rethinking of working class history. For Chakravarti, the turn towards a cultural analysis was a fundamental departure from what he characterized as the economism of Indian liberal Marxist historiography. Chakravarti argued that while a Marxian political economy provided powerful explanations for working class history in India, his central concerns about the particular logic of culture or consciousness simply could not be explained by political economy alone. In fact, he claimed culture is the unthought of Indian Marxism. Spivak's analysis did not stop here. For her, it was pertinent to deconstruct the subalternist mode of deconstruction as a way to prevent both objectification of the subaltern and control of the subaltern subject through the construction of historical knowledge about subalternity. In the process of reconstructing the subaltern historiography, Spivak issued the most trenchant internal critique of the project's conceptualization of the subaltern, namely the failure to conceptualize the subjectivity of the subaltern woman. Before leaving to Hyderabad, I also had a look at her own YouTube speech in which she regrets her statement. She was said, I was using it's a can the subaltern speak at that point of time as a framework for my further argument. Kancha Elaya provides a significant intervention in subaltern studies with the 9th volume. Elaya began with a historical critique. I quote a small line from him. Mainstream historiography has done nothing to incorporate the Dalit Bahujan perspective in the writing of Indian history. Subaltern studies is no exception to this. Elaya noted the failure of subaltern studies project to actively engage in the political and cultural concerns of Dalits, literally meaning oppressed, or the former untouchables in Indian society. He argues that for a project concerned with understanding subordination in Indian society, the omission of the ways in which caste power functioned to alienate Dalits was enormous. For Elaya, it was the absence of any analysis on Dalits specifically which was a fundamental problem. He argued that this was not surprising considering that all traditions of history writing in India had neglected to include Dalit as subjects of history. Elia's resolution was to issue a call for fellow Dalits to write their own history. I quote from him, our history is a book of blank pages to fill with whatever letters, language we wish to write, as we would wish to write. So he also provided the justification. We leave it that. So Dalit writing, literature as post-colonial writing. As students, researchers, teachers, we have been in the initial stages discussing subaltern writing from the theoretical framework of post-colonial writing. But later on we realized that this umbrella term probably has to be problematized because it contains in itself problem. For example, Dalit writing or Aboriginal Australian writing or First Indian writers are not at all happy with, because they say it still valorizes colonialism at the center. Subaltern studies as a historiographical project has long ended. I'm quoting from them only. It is now a post-colonial project that has moved beyond the discipline of history in the preface to Subaltern Studies, Volume 10. Thus, they say, we have moved, expanded our critical focus to include elite texts and practices. Our interests have ranged beyond the discipline of history, and we have tackled issues of contemporary politics and politics of knowledge. This shows that the situation within the Subaltern project had fundamentally shifted. To use the subalternist's own words, I quote, beyond conventional boundaries, beyond the discipline of history. That's why we literature people also enter into it. Now it's a kind of interdisciplinary discourse. Literature. Compared to other writings, Dalits and other subaltern writings are more interdisciplinary in nature and committed to consciousness raising. Their writing reject canons and dominant aesthetic criteria and propose an alternative aesthetics. Dalits and other subaltern writings in regional languages are getting translated into international languages, and from one regional language to another, despite differences in the socio-cultural and political situation, their writings share a counter-cultural position. I do agree with my former speakers in saying that Dalit discourse, Dalit literature, Dalit writing is not at all a homogeneous. It has its own varieties and multiple points, but there is something which they share as a collective. Dalit literary movements are an offshoot of Dalit socio-cultural political movements against the caste system, which came into dominance through, I quote, a process of turmoil, warfare, contradiction, and conflict, again quoting from Ombud, and are characterized by their counter-cultural position. Ambedkar's metaphor of revolution and counter-revolution is relevant in this context. For him, at that point of time, embracing Buddhism was a cultural revolution. Cultural hegemony is located in civil society and are exercised in the forms of values, ideas, notions of the dominant discourse. The dominant discourse exercises power over the dominated either by coercion, power, or by imposing or manufacturing the consent. The role of media, I'm sure the coming sessions probably would discuss that. The role of media in constructing and perpetuating these images of the other. Though Dalit and oral tradition has been projecting Dalit history and culture, the written expression surfaced only during the second, third decade of the 20th century, when Dalit voices began to be increasingly brought to the surface. We know the agency of the upper caste, class, or elites to speak for the others is increasingly being questioned, challenged, countered. Along with overt forms of political activism, literature also provides a potent subaltern mode and became a significant discursive site of resistance to elitist historiography, both colonial and national, and dominant cultural hegemony. The spirit of Dalit creativity in our country witnessed a fillip after the Buddhist conversion of Dalits under the leadership of Baba Saheb Ambedkar, which in itself is a counter-cultural event. The numerous attempts to consolidate a newly discovered sense of cultural identity distinct from Brahminic Hinduism grew strong in the 60s and 70s. The inspiration for assertion of culture came from, of course, in the Indian context, from African American socio-political cultural movement. I wouldn't detail because I know there is another paper on that. Dalit, Adivasi, women, LGBT writing, and the question of identity. Dalit identity is a collective one inclusive of numerous castes. Despite minor variations in their life world and practices, they share common background, values, and practices. The normative legitimacy of Dalit literature and identity as a homogeneous one is based on the principle and practice of untouchability. Hence, Dalit writings exercise an agency for empowerment of Dalit community and the destruction of a social structure based on untouchability. Dalit literary expressions has an emancipatory potential and hence need to be viewed in relation to its contribution in empowering struggles against caste system in the process of pursuing collective interest of Dalits. Much of what is thought to be our common culture is the selective transmission of class, caste, and dominant cultural values. Thus, engagement in anti-caste struggle through a construction of Dalit culture has to be understood in the context of the politics to challenge hegemonic culture and Brahminic social order. The challenge to hegemony is also a task to create and sustain a counterculture through the politics of resistance. Dalit literature interrogates and challenges the oppressive and discriminating culture in the struggle for human emancipation. Dalits who were subjected to dual colonization, the British and the national Brahminic Hindu, had produced substantial countercultural writings in the form of poems, pamphlets, speeches, folk arts, including theater. For example, we have jalsas. And the countercultural anti-caste discourses already initiated in the 12th century by radical Bhakti poets, mention has already been made, so I'll be brief, in various parts of the country, has grown strong in the late 19th century with Jyotiba Phule's strident rhetoric against Brahminic Hindu hegemony in Indian reform and nationalist movements. Ambedkar's speeches and writings challenged the Brahminic Hindu culture more vehemently than anybody else. Similar countercultural writings were produced in various regional languages in our country, which are now available through translations. We have many anthologies. To the other subalterns as well, literature has been by far the most effective means of articulating their need for freedom, identity, and recognition. The motive of disinheritance and deprivation, prime reason is landlessness. The motive of disinheritance and deprivations runs through the whole gamut of Dalit Adivasi writing, as it attempts to give its own version of post-contact history. Coming to creative literature. Creative writing, literature, also presents or constructs the image of the other. Mainstream writings in almost all multicultural countries, whether it is Australia or Canada or America or Africa, or even including India, has been constructing, endorsing, valorizing their construction of the other. Dalit, Adivasi, women, LGBT, ethnic groups, minorities, as evil and uncivilized. These writings have been justifying dominant cultures, languages, their values, aesthetics, and often ignored or silenced other counter-cultural voices. Hence, the task of subaltern writers is to break the cultural silence, the process through which Adivasis or Moolavasis, Dalits, lost their cultural strength and were forced to think and act according to the idioms and symbols of the dominant nationalities in Indian situation. Women especially, black, colored, Dalit women, or LGBT writings assert their specific subjectivities and identities and experiences in their writings. Though there has never been a period, I've already told you that, colonial, mainstream or maelstream historiography and subaltern historiography. Contemporary literary scenario witness to the unprecedented growth of writing from the margins. Fringe cultures expands and grows into a counterculture by defining its own values in opposition to the mainstream norms through their writings. I have already given examples. So, 2 more minutes. Dalit aesthetics. I don't have to tell you anything because works are already there, discussion will continue also. But just mentioning how the discussion of Dalit aesthetics could also relate to other theoretical positions already articulated by their counterparts. Like, First Nation writers already theorized on, Australian Aboriginal writers, just to give an idea of that, so that people who are interested can further pursue. Dalit aesthetics is posited an oxymoron. Why? Because aesthetics is believed to be the sole preserve of caste Hindus. Really, it has its root in Bhakti movements, though it has its own limitations. Poetry during the Bhakti period. A whole range of poets scanning across the country were challenging the given standards of aesthetics. Mention has already been made to Kabir, Ravidas, Tukaram, Chokmala, etc. But it had its own limitations, because during the 13th century, the Abhangas of Chokmala were primarily surrendering kind of thing. despite the fact that there are protests. Dedication to the domain of a sacred as a solution to poverty. Yes, Shivagami was pointing out. We also have similar literatures in Malayalam. Kujala, I don't know whether you have read Kujala and Krishna. The poverty of Kujala could be solved by dedicating himself to Krishna. But Dalit's poverty cannot be solved by such request. That's the point. So deliverance of life sufferings through devotion, surrender. That is the limitation as I see it in the Bhakti ideology. Influence of black aesthetics, yes. There is a paper separately, so I'm just ignoring that. Dalit writers, First Nation Canadian writers, Australian Aboriginal writers, most of the African writers, and their writings focus on racial pride. In our case, it could be caste pride. Construction of black identity as opposed to Negro identity. Just like Dalit identity is a kind of proud announcement came from the Dalit group. Formerly, as we all know, they have been referring to Achus or Panchamas or etc. etc. All Dalit writings or all fourth world writings do appreciate their cultural heritage. Commitment to produce works that reflect the culture and experience of these people. It is also characterized by a political militancy. That's why Professor Dasan was referring to that. If you talk caste in the classroom, as I've been experiencing through the last couple of decades, caste in the classroom is not a thing to be welcomed by either students or academics. So, if you add a kind of political militancy, just as it had in the Black Power movement or Black Panther movement, as well as with the Dalit Panther movement, black aesthetics, just like Dalit aesthetics, is the spiritual sister of Dalit movement. So you have a close parallels, but I don't think that there are many researchers who have explored the possibility of taking other aesthetic positions. African American is obvious because we started our research in the 1990s. Some of us are very familiar, but that's why I'm saying go to some of the theoretical positions articulated by fourth world writers, especially First Nation Canadian writers and Australian Aboriginal writers. That's all I know. Maybe there are more. So let me conclude by saying that I hope the fourth world writers would continue their counter-cultural writing with more vigor until the discriminations based on descent and gender disappears. This workshop, I'm sure, would deliberate on the necessity to rewrite history and cultural cartography, foregrounding Dalits and other subaltern cultures and systems of knowledges, and would persuade the scholars, researchers, and academics to rethink culture and pedagogy. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Center for Comparative Literature, School of Humanities, I would like to thank our Vice Chancellor, Professor Ramakrishna Ramaswamy, Professor Amitav Dasgupta, Ms. P. Shivakami, Professor M. Dasan, Mr. A.S. Dasan, and all the other delegates who have come from other universities, and our very own departmental head, Professor Tutun Mukherjee, and Bhimaiya sir, for successfully organizing this seminar. Thank you, one and all. There will be a tea break now for 10 minutes, and after the tea is served right outside, and after that, the first session would be held.